Welcome to the Star Chamber. I'm Ryan Swayze, a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the founder and president of the Walk the Talk Foundation, a nonprofit that advocates for and advises currently serving and former military service members going through the arduous journey of administrative processes and investigations in our government.
And I am Francescagraham, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Advisor for the Walk the Talk Foundation. For all our returning guests, welcome back. And for our new listeners, thank you for tuning in. Before we begin this week's topic, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button, check out our Walk the Talk Foundation website, and hit that donate button if you think we're doing a good job. Also, check out our newsletter, the DoD Times Redacted, on all the socials, including LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. Links in the description. All right, Star Chamber listeners, let's get started. Welcome back, Star Chamber listeners. We are very excited to have our thousands of listeners tuning back in for another great episode of the Star Chamber. And we have another fantastic guest today. He is a retired Lieutenant Colonel, and you may know him from his very well-written, well-spoken public presence on LinkedIn, the Radar, and other posts. And his name is Tony Carr. So just a quick bio before we get started. So Tony is an independent writer and voice on leadership, operations, and organizations. He spent 23 years in the United States Air Force, retiring as a lieutenant colonel with more than 400 hours in combat and a successful squadron command tour. Tony has been an operations director for Amazon and has served for 10 years on the board of the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight, where he has advocated for reform of the defense personnel, judiciary, and acquisition systems. Tony created the John Q. Public blog, which he grew into a massive online community forum, advancing the alternative United States Air Force conversation, providing a channel for public accountability and exposure of institutional issues. He now writes at the Radar on Substack from his home in Manchester, England, and occasionally delivers keynote speeches on leadership to public and private United Kingdom organizations. So before we get started, just a quick disclaimer. The opinions and views expressed by guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not represent the official policies, positions, or endorsements of the United States Air Force, the Department of Defense, or any other government entity. This discussion is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as reflecting the official stance of any military or governmental organization. What do we say, Ryan?
Suck it, Poindexters.
Suck it, Poindexters. I don't know why, but that just doesn't get old to me.
It will never get old.
It will never get old.
And it will never not apply.
Exactly. Exactly. So welcome, Tony, onto the show. We're so excited to have you. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's fantastic to be here. You know, you captured it pretty well. I started in the Air Force at 17 years of age. I did all my formative years in the Air Force. I was one of those idealist youngsters who joined for sort of big, lofty reasons, but ended up staying for different reasons because I liked the value system, I liked the people, the teams, and I felt inspired by getting to work with some people who came from different backgrounds, different walks of life than I did, but who all had the same goal of making our enemies afraid and then making them bleed if we had to. I really enjoyed that.
I like it.
And then there's some reasons why that journey ended, actually before I might have wanted it to, but in a way, totally my decision. And I'll probably elaborate on why that happened because it's what led me to sort of the activity that I do now. And then, I took that detour through Amazon, which I did for self-interested reasons to get myself and my family where I wanted us to be. And then when that had run its course, I've since then allowed myself the luxury of having time to concentrate on things I think are important. So when I'm not doing all those things you mentioned, which is actually probably a minority of my time, I'm busy goofing off, running around Manchester, schlepping around like a normal citizen, or going out into the countryside and doing long walks, which I tend to do most days between March and September. If you know anything about the UK and about the northwest of England, you'll know that the times outside of March to September are not good times to walk in the countryside.
Well, TC, I'm excited for this one because unbeknownst to me, I came across your work many, many years ago while you were publishing for JQ Public, and I read what I think is just pure poetry and still remains pure poetry in regards to military leadership culture, and that was the article of The Rise of the Gutless Air Force Colonel, an article I have shared literally thousands of times to thousands of colonels throughout the Air Force and military. I didn't know it was you at the time, and then we veritably crossed paths a few times in the virtual space, but this is our first face-to-face, and I'm excited to share some insights and garner benefit from your quick wit.
And
well, yeah, sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to say, and speaking of your quick wit, so there's one word in one of your articles that I think that I just love and I cannot get out of my head, and that I think can perfectly describe many aspects of today's conversation. And that word is enshittification.
Google it. It's a thing.
It's a thing. So Tony, if you don't mind, could you just describe for our listeners what is enshittification, just so my mother knows I'm not cussing? And then also, what drove you to become an advocate for military reform? Because I think those two are pretty linked together.
They are. They are. Let's see. I can't remember who I stole it from. I did steal it. I definitely didn't dream that one up. And as Ryan says, you can find it out there on some Urban Dictionary somewhere. So it's existed. But I read it in someone else's work a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, and I was like, wow, that word is huge. It captures a huge universe of activity. But I try to use it sparingly, because if I don't, then it loses its verve. But I think the way I would describe it is I'll run back to Air Force theorists, and I'll go to John Boyd and say that I can describe this through the law of, I can describe it through thermodynamics. Anything we set in motion starts at that instant to degrade. It starts to die. It starts to have entropy. And we have to then take active steps to prevent it from decaying. And when we don't, that decay accelerates. And the closer it gets to the point of death, it gets faster. And we have to notice that and respond. What I noticed today is that there's an awful lot of things that are broken, that are in the sort of acceleration phase of entropy, that are not getting the kinds of reactions that I think they should. And that's why I find myself actively, intellectually engaged by so many subjects. I didn't plan on doing this with my life. I actually, for a long time, I didn't have a plan. And then when I was in the Air Force, my plan was to just do that. But there were three things that happened when I was in the Air Force that led me into reform as a fascination, and eventually as a vocation, if that's what I want to call it. And to get to the first one, I got to go back 20 years. So I don't know where you all were in 2004, but I was in the Pentagon, and I was working in the chairman of the Joint Chiefs PA office as an intern. Actually, I'd gotten an internship as a captain in the Air Force to go to the Pentagon for 2 years. The whole point of that exercise is to take captains who we think maybe will stick around for a while and maybe have decent potential, and expose them to the bureaucracy early so they understand it. And so they can kind of get past that sort of curtain being pulled back and deal with it and figure out how to maneuver in it. And it usually makes them more effective as they go along. And it did with me. But in that process, you, of course, have to lose some of your idealism, and you have to become less naive. So what I noticed, and I'm going to do this at a high level because I don't want to get anywhere near a radioactive subject. But when I was working in that particular office with a very high security clearance, I had access to a lot of documents and a lot of things that the public didn't see. You might remember back then, the DoD got into trouble over something called Abu Ghraib. And this was the allegation that there was torture activity, banned activity happening with detainees in our captivity in Iraq. It happened at the time. When I looked at what we were saying to the world and what was happening internally, there was clearly a difference between the truth and what we were saying. Okay. And then when I looked at what happened, I was pretty dismayed, because if you guys recall, what happened is we pushed accountability and culpability for all of that. We admitted some stuff had gone wrong. We pushed it all down the chain of command as far as we could. And we punished very low ranking figures, 2 or 3 people who were sort of at the coalface of a situation. Now, you can make the Nazis at Nuremberg argument that they were given an unlawful order and they shouldn't have carried it out. But as those of us on this podcast know, the presumption of lawfulness in an order is well established in jurisprudence. It's well established in the minds and hearts of everybody who follows military orders. You know that if you're going to get out of your foxhole and charge the hill by yourself to challenge an order, you're not going to have any support. You're probably going to get cut down. You're going to lose whatever you have in doing that. Even if you're proven right and vindicated, you probably won't get those things back. So everybody knowing that means that you don't often see people challenge lawful orders. That's not an excuse for the people who violated unlawful orders at Abu Ghraib, and they should have been punished. But what should have also happened in my mind was more institutional level reform and transparency. We should have admitted everything that had gone wrong, how it had gone wrong, instead of punishing a reserve brigadier general who ran the prisons and really didn't know what was going on. She deserved to be fired probably for just ineptitude. But the soldiers who were fired probably deserve or were punished deserved to be. But that's not where it should have stopped. So that was sort of number one thing that tumbled in my mind. I literally got depressed after that by realizing that we had taken low-level functionaries and made them responsible for kind of the worst transgression of our value system that I noticed in a long time.
Very Me Lai in flavor there.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking the only person that was truly punished was the lieutenant, even though he had passed his con-op up to at least the concept of operations, up to at least the colonel level in his organization. And oh, by the way, do you want to know who the investigating officer was for that investigation, that initial investigation that preceded the year-long cover-up and said nothing to see here, nothing wrong? Do you know who that was? Little fun fact, Tony?
Powell.
Colin Powell was the investigating officer. Nothing to see here, nothing wrong. And then a year-long cover-up ensued.
Yeah. So, and the thing is, even in the AR-15, the Taguba report that eventually did get filed, that sort of constituted the official position and the cover-up. You could still see the fingerprints of lots of people who should, and there should have been a lot more transparency. But that was me being an idealistic young captain and getting stripped of some of that naivete. And later on at law school, studying Me Lai, I saw the same parallel you called out. The second thing that happened to me that started to change my mind about a long-term military career was actually a little bit more innocuous. I went to the Air Force Strategy School. Ryan will recognize the School of Air and Space Studies is like a cool year-long strategy program that's run for 50 majors or so in the Air Force. When I graduated, I got offered a really cool job, but it was a year away from family in the desert, which is it's just not something I would ever voluntarily do. So I let somebody else have that. And I used my performance to parlay a job in Germany where my family wanted to go. So we went to 17th Air Force. A numbered Air Force staff assignment in the Air Force is about as unglamorous as it gets for a major that just graduated from a staff school. So it probably should have hurt my career, though it didn't. But while I was there, I was supposed to just be an operations planner, but I was plugged into what this numbered Air Force was doing. It was the U.S. Africa Command component, Air Force component. So we're developing all sorts of operational plans for the continent of Africa. But I was actually helping the senior leaders of the organization with a lot of other stuff. And I came to be part of a discussion about a discipline case that the two-star commander of 17th Air Force had disposed of. I won't name the person, any of the people involved, including the general, but he said something that really stuck with me in a discussion. He said, when asked why was the punishment for these two people so harsh? These are two people who got involved in an inappropriate relationship. So an E9 got involved with an E5 or E6 in a relationship that was somehow, proscribed by the Air Force, not permitted. It wasn't a conflict of interest. They weren't in the same chain of command, and there were no victims, but they were still punished quite harshly. So the question was asked why, and his response was, "I think by the time people are 28 or 29 or 30 years old, they're not going to change anymore. So if I see somebody committing misconduct, breaking the rules when they're 35 or 40, I'm not going to hold back punishment because I think that they should, they're not going to change. They're not able to be rehabilitated." Now, I wasn't a lawyer at the time, but I kind of stepped back and thought to myself, So what you're telling me, General, is that your decision about punishment using the sacred authority that's been given you has nothing to do with their relative culpability, with the consequences, with the evidence, with what's constructive for everybody involved. It has to do with your personal individual view of human nature and how you see the world. And you're essentially making a judgment this to that so and that got me thinking about what's the level of training and education and development that we're giving to general officers who are involved in quasi-judicial role playing throughout the rest of their career that gets bigger and bigger and more nationally significant. I started to dig around in that subject and find that the more I found out, the more mortified I was that our generals were unqualified to be in quasi-judicial roles. I never dropped that feeling for the rest of my career, which went on for a few more years. And then after I got out and had more time to dig into individual cases, it really did help me pull myself into a reform space. So that's 2 waypoints. So if I want to find out where an aircraft is going, I need 3 radar returns for it to be reliable. So there was a third point. And the third point was more of a bigger point on the radar. It was my whole squadron command tour. You as an Air Force officer, this is what you're trying to reach. You're trying to get there. And I don't know how Ryan characterized his time as a lieutenant, but when I was a lieutenant in the Air Force, as a brand new pilot, in my case, I walked into a squadron and the squadron commander was a larger than life figure. This person named Freddie Cianciolo, he passed away, he's gone now, but he was an incredible leader and he had masses of authority in his hands and he had control over the decisions that impacted me and my peers. Mm-hmm. So somewhere between that time and the 12 years that passed when I got my own crack at command or whatever it was, 10 years that passed, none of that was true anymore. So when I took over a squadron, what I found was I had no resources, nothing organic that I had as a lever in my hand. I had no staff, no one to update the training of my aviators after they went and flew training sorties, no one to process their travel claims, no one to do their administration, no one to do their reports. They were all doing it for themselves. And that didn't just piss me off because of what it did to squadron life. It pissed me off because it's 2 other things. It's organized corruption because we're telling a huge lie about how many resources it takes to actually run a competent Air Force. Mm-hmm. But it's also dangerous to national defense because if you have squadrons that are self-supporting, what they're doing is telling an elaborate lie about how much they can do. In the meantime, they're not doing and focusing on things they should be because they're doing things they shouldn't be. And there's a finite amount of energy they have. So they're getting worse at what they do. And so my prediction was in 10 years, we're going to have a readiness problem. And it's way worse than I thought it would be because we've lost a lot of pilots. We have a pilot shortage now in the Air Force, triggered or at least exacerbated by these things I'm talking about. Squadron life becoming almost unlivable, definitely not as enjoyable as it used to be, and commanders having no authority. I didn't have any authority over the main things that mattered to my people. I had all the responsibility, and I certainly would be accountable if I took them to war and we didn't do our jobs or I didn't keep them safe and get them home. But I didn't have the authority to really do my job. So those 3 things together, I think it was May 11th of 2011. I'd only been in command for 6 months. And I rolled out of bed one morning and told my wife, this is it. My presumption has moved from I'm staying in unless something changes my mind to I'm not staying in unless something changes my mind. And after another year, I'd only become more convinced that it was time to get out. So I went into my boss's office and he said, he put an 06 promotion on the table and said, here's what we have planned for you. And I said, here's my retirement paperwork. I'm not staying. And I knew I was going to go to law school and I already had in my mind that maybe I would exercise the newfound freedom to speak freely, start highlighting some of these issues. That's kind of what got me into 2013 and starting my own blog. Is those things. There are other little things along the way, and some of it was some of the same things we're talking about now. So the military becoming a playground for sort of, I would argue, becoming a little bit too much of an environment for testing out different social theories and getting people irritated and focused on the wrong stuff. So if you go back to 2010, 2012 or so, you literally couldn't walk 10 meters in the military without a sexual assault response training event. And it was sort of blocking out the sun. As much as I thought it was appropriate that we have a new focus, it was so overdone that it was literally turning people away from the issue. And that's one example of a dozen more that convinced me that we lost a group of our culture.
Well, it's what's funny, but not also funny, also terrible, not funny at all, is that you're right. You did stumble over sexual assault, sexual harassment training every 5 seconds in the military. And it was entirely ineffective and useless at the same time. It's like, what has it done to fix anything? Absolutely nothing.
I had a friend of
Terrible.
mine. He was a fellow lieutenant colonel who was in another squadron. He actually tried to come to my squadron, and I wasn't allowed to take him on. He wanted out of his unit because his commander didn't like his attitude about certain issues, and this was one of them. And he got disciplined because he actually brought up in the training to the responsible person, how many prosecutors have we hired? How many defense attorneys have we hired? How many investigators have we hired? How many new resources have we actually put into preventing sexual assault, actually dissuading and deterring predators and making them sure that they're going to be prosecuted, they're going to be caught in the first place, versus how much we've spent on all this training that didn't end up making a dent in the problem.
So I wanted to go back to your time in Squadron Command. So you were in Squadron Command for 2 years?
Just about 21 months.
I want to go back to your time in Squadron Command. And you had mentioned that was your third major kind of waypoint, and then your second waypoint was your observation of that general officer who had all of this quasi-judicial authority. At the time that you were dealing with or making these observations on the general officer, and then you now go into command and now you are exercising this quasi-judicial authority, how did your observations change about not just why don't we have the right protections the right training to make it so that people are better trained to exercise these authorities, but also why does this system even exist the way that it does with so much punishment capability in a completely quasi-judicial role?
Yeah, so it's hard for me to go back and put myself in the brain that I was in then, because I had so much has happened since then, and I think my aperture's widened a lot beyond my little part of the Air Force. But even then, I felt that, look, non-judicial punishment essentially is a wide open door to a commander just not liking the cut of someone's jib and just deciding to ruin them. Mm-hmm. And as much as that, there are remedies that existed for people to get out, to try to fight back into their careers after they've been punished, they generally, in the Air Force that we inhabited then, and probably even more so now, they weren't really going to do anything for you because it had definitely become a one mistake and no defect type of situation. I came across several cases of people who were trying to keep their careers going after they'd been in trouble very, very early. So there was a case of a lieutenant or a case of a captain who was coming up for major, who, as a lieutenant, had gotten a DUI. So this is a 10-year-old offense. He had gotten a DUI, didn't hide it from his chain of command, actually didn't wait for it to show up in some blotter somewhere. He actually told everybody what he did. He was transparent. He did everything he could to be forthright about it. He was an exceptional performer. But what happened in 2010 is that the Air Force decided to reduce itself. It decided to fire a bunch of people and reduce its end strength. And when it did that, they needed to find the low-hanging fruit to pick. It needed a way to bureaucratize that exercise. And the very first thing that happened is anybody with any discipline in their record, even if it was that old, was plucked. And my protests over that to try to retain this individual and keep his career going, because I thought he was a great leader and had great potential, they went nowhere. And in fact, at one point I was backed off and told if I didn't back off, I'd start to become infected with whatever he was infected with, conceptually. So I do think, the legislation that happened a few years ago when I was sort of in my Amazon time and not paying that much attention to military affairs will have fundamentally changed some of the reality. But the reality of what happens to a lot of people with NJP, letters of reprimand, admonishments, letters of counseling, especially our enlisted members, still there, hasn't changed.
DC, I'm going to pitch you a null hypothesis. You tell me what you think. And this is kind of based on the veritable masterpiece, which is that JQ Public Blog article on the rise of the gutless colonel. And this question pertains to a lot of the work we do at the foundation. And you kind of alluded to it in talking about readiness and obfuscating how poor our readiness level is. And when we say we, at the ground level, at the operator level, we see it, or we saw it as operators every day. But somehow, when it went up and burbled up to the leadership, that message was clouded at best. And the relationship to that and what we do at the foundation is these avenues of redress, these avenues of recourse that we're supposed to have that go up through this 06 level the 06 being the worst rank in the United States military. Not the worst people. Francesca's brother, you are an upstanding gentleman and officer, I'm sure.
He's amazing.
But that rank is the root of all evil, I am convinced. Because the motivations are to obfuscate, are to hide the truth, and the officers in that level are rewarded by towing the line and not telling inconvenient truths, I believe. And that plays out in many aspects, operationally, readiness, as well as avenues of redress and recourse, things that we're active on. What do you think?
There's two reactions I have to that are, one's probably organizational in nature, and the other one is just maybe more something I've been thinking about lately. I'll see if you agree or if it has any intuition with you. The first is that I'm hearkening back to a military where there was a lot more trust in officers that were more junior. Part of what I've been criticizing lately is the top heaviness of the military. I've been criticizing it for a decade off and on, but I've got a piece I'm working on now that'll publish soon that's trying to bring some data, some evidence to demonstrate that the more top heavy we get, the less we trust people further down the rank structure, despite the fact that they're perfectly trustworthy and perfectly capable of giving the assessments we need. I'll never forget being a 40-year-old lieutenant colonel with 2 master's degrees and a distinguished flying cross, and I've got a general asking me, basically grilling me on whether I'm training my people correctly, or questioning the choices and the priorities I'm selecting, and pretending that I'm too young, and actually using the phrase that we've got young officers out there making these decisions instead of the people who should be making them. And of course, my response was, no, I'm exactly who should be making this decision. The context for that was a 3-ship mission that I was launched on 30 hours notice to a drop zone. It's a classified mission I still can't talk about. It went over a drop zone in a country we didn't normally fly over on short notice to try to prevent a company-sized element of people that we cared about from getting overrun. And we had to resupply them rapidly, and we had to do it from a high enough altitude that we wouldn't risk getting engaged and creating a political military incident. So he wanted to control me from 6,000 miles away, and he couldn't because
while steeping his tea, if I recall the article.
Oh yeah, that was. I remember. Yeah, that was good.
The tactical general, I love it.
But I think part of what's going on here is we're not trusting captains, majors, lieutenant colonels. We're not trusting tech sergeants, master sergeants the way we used to. And I think part of the reason for that is we're too top heavy. If I keep asking the whys, I'll eventually get to a root cause. And I think somewhere around we've top heavied ourselves out of trusting perfectly capable, trustworthy people is part of what I'm critiquing there. And if we got away from that tendency, then colonels might not be the villains they've become. But I think the second part of my reaction is colonels have become middle management. They're in colonels they're in a horrible position. Well, arguably horrible position. I think half of them. So if I just take the Air Force as an example, there's at any given moment, there's probably 600 active duty lieutenant colonels in the Air Force, which is way too many. But of that 600, there's probably 300 who know for sure they're dead. They're never going to advance. Their career's over. This is their last tour. They're just trying to have a nice last tour and avoid getting in any kind of trouble before they're done. If they don't have 2 years time in grade, they're trying to get to that point so that they can secure their retirement as an 06. Even though, honestly, it doesn't matter because it's not how their pay is calculated anyway. But that's neither here nor there. Those people you can almost rely on a little bit more for candid judgments and for earnest, open-eared treatment of their subordinates to a higher degree than those who think they're still alive. And these ones are the psychopaths or sociopaths, I guess it's probably more fitting, because they're not living in the same world as the rest of us. There's only 25 a year that are going to make brigadier general. 25 out of 300 who have a chance is a tiny percentage. Most of them are dead and don't know it yet. But because they're kind of like Andy Jassy, if you give him $500 million, you create a frustrated billionaire. You give a colonel, you create a frustrated brigadier general, because that's what they've been in this for all along. They want to get to the big time. So that's where the moral cowardice creeps in. That's or that's where the moral cowardice that was already there gets exposed and gets favored instead of making more courageous decisions. But I do recognize that in the old days, we would have said a major's middle management. If you watch like Band of Brothers, majors were running battalions. That's a middle management position. These days, colonels are doing that, or maybe even less than that. They're tiny spans of control. 1, 2-star generals are doing those jobs. So they feel like they're getting it from their subordinates. They're getting complaints about how they don't have resources, they don't have latitude, they don't have freedom, they can't execute properly, they don't have enough people. They're getting it from their bosses about how they need to make more cuts. They need to get rid of bad performers. They need to pay attention to small things. And so they're sort of in the siege. I wrote a more recent article called Notes from the Siege. And it was maybe the corollary to the original article about gutless colonels. And it was about what it's like to be a wing commander, to be a successful colonel in today's Air Force. Very, very difficult position. But, I don't think that gets us any closer to the normative desired space, which is tell the truth, be honest, be transparent, listen to people, make sensible judgments. If everybody just did that, quit worrying about how they look in the shower, would be a lot better off. That's the politics, which I think is where we'll end up going. But I think we've politicized the senior ranks of our military a lot more than people commonly recognize. I used to say politicized, meaning political behavior. Now we're creeping more toward partisan behavior, which is a lot more dangerous, of course. Or maybe not creeping, maybe we're stepping or striding or leaping there. But political behavior has been there for a while. It's become necessary to behave politically to get promoted in our military. And that means the incentives need to be rearranged. They're arranged toward being dishonest, because that's what politics is.
Yeah, and just for reference, post-World War II, our ratio was 1 general officer, flag officer for every 6,000 personnel. And that ratio today is now 1 to 1,400, I believe. So a 5 times increase in our top heaviness, if my math is correct.
I want to see if my numbers match yours. Yeah, I have the same thing you do. I've got a chart that I just updated that shows the progression from 1945 to now. And we continue to step down the span of control of general officers. So it's no wonder that they're overhandling everybody else. So what that does is, first of all, it's 2 burglaries. It burglarizes the generals and the admirals because they don't have the span of control they should have. It's been given to their peers because there's so many of them. So the authority's been chopped up into smaller bits. And of course, a smaller military means, and an ever shrinking military with less latitude and authority in the first place, means that there's less to go around. But it also then ends up burglarizing, in the second instance, everybody else. Because those generals are pulling authority up to themselves. It belongs way, way below them. And part of the reason I left the Air Force is because one of the things that played on my mind was, okay, behind door number 1, I have a civilian life that I can go determine myself, which probably will have some struggles with adaptation. And, I might not do great, but I can figure that out on my own, and I'll accept those risks. Or door number 2 is I can move 3 or 4 times in the next 5 years, convince my kids that I'm a shithead, that I don't care about their quality of life while they're in high school, and have no authority anyway, because the brigadier generals have none. Really, they're just execution agents. And I think maybe that doesn't matter, but that's at odds with what we understand. That's at odds with what the public understands. It's at odds with what Congress, I think most of those in Congress would think. They think a brigadier general has a lot of authority. I think they'd be stunned if they actually did the study and found what generals do, what 1- and 2-star generals do with their time when they're not busy trying to rehearse and be approved for the 2-star and beyond promos.
And I think that's a really good segue, as we're getting close to wrapping up the show, is really kind of what are your, broadly, and you've touched on it quite a bit already, but broadly, what are your thoughts on leadership in the military, and then also what are your current focus areas and concerns that you'd like to share?
And I kind of like to tack on the question to refine it a little better, but to what we're trying to accomplish, which is what you mentioned, increased transparency, and maybe more salient is this concept that bad news is okay. And broadly put, this is what we see a lot of the organizational and personal resistance when we're sending up an Article 138 that's a complaint of redress, or an inspector general complaint, or whatever. The institution and leadership reaction, especially at this 06, this middle management level, is to crush it. And why is that, and how do we fix it?
Yeah, this touches on concerns that I have, and it all traces back to sort of where I am in my evolution of how I think about leadership as a subject, military and otherwise. To segue into it, I can talk about I can allude to a conversation I had recently, which is with a 3-star general friend of mine who's still on active duty. So I won't divulge who that person is, but they're in the middle of a process of having a complaint against them. And it's not the first time they've had one, but they're super nervous about it. And they're calling me to just vent, but also to let me counsel them a little bit and calm them down because we're friends. And I'm trying to reinforce to this person that we have to get to a point where it's okay to just do your job and accept that if you made some mistakes, that's okay. And hopefully they're survivable, but if they're not, that's okay too. But also just accept that complaints are going to happen and they're uncomfortable. And if the institutional military would allow that to be, would allow them to feel okay, to allow people to be promoted who've had complaints against them, if they weren't substantiated, or have allowed people to recover from early mistakes, then people would be less apt to lie, cover up, and try to hide who they are. We might know who they are. We might actually be able to focus on character in our promotions instead of focusing on the ability to be politically adept and show the, performative and show the system what we think it wants to see. And I had this conversation a lot in Amazon. In Amazon, we didn't promote beyond, I would say, the director level, so up to the executive level. We didn't promote for character. We were looking for people who could be obsessive about finance, for people who could do PR, for people who could tell a company story in a good way, and who could tell the story, a downward-facing story to the employee population in a good way. But we weren't looking for people who had conviction. And that was a change for Amazon because in the Bezos days of systems thinking, he wanted to hear disagreements and he begged them out of people. Where I am on leadership these days is like, it's always an evolution or maybe it's a devolution. We'll find out when I'm all done. But where I am now is I'm trying to help people think about it more analytically. In other words, to pull apart the word and understand what it really is. Because if we are clear about what we're trying to do in a particular moment or in a particular role, and therefore clear about what we're not trying to do, we're probably going to be more effective. Here's what I mean by that. I think we refer to people as leaders who are not leading. Executives aren't leaders. They're just managers. They're managing finances, they're managing public perceptions, they're managing share price. That's what executives do, or the military equivalent in public service. But what they're not doing is leading. Leading is people, it's vision, it's values, it's convictions, it's principles. It's having, the moral character to make tough calls, but it's taking care of people. Sometimes taking care of people by having disciplinary engagements with people. That's leadership. But then there's this other thing, administration. That's order and rules and process. I think people who have manager or leader in their duty title are doing all three of those things at different times. And they're trying to juggle all those imperatives all the time. And if they understand that, then they might know what space they're in and not misapply one skill set in a moment where another is called for. But that's coming from sort of an individual coaching perspective. I think where I am on the development of leadership at an institutional level, both public and private in the US now, is that the incentives that we have established are taking us in the wrong direction. And I think we do have to be disruptive. So some of the disruption that's happening is probably healthy because we have a calcified system that needs to be shaken up. What remains to be seen is whether that disruption is followed by reform or whether it's just disruption, which all that will do is, shake a statue and the statue will just still lay there. We have to actually do something different. So that's what I'm hoping to see is that we get to reform. But those are sort of my thoughts on leadership. So I think if I had one big concern, one overarching concern at this moment, it's that everything that we've been doing with our generals and admirals, our flag officers for the last 20 years, 30 years probably, going back to the mid-90s, has been walking them closer to classic political participation and behavior. We probably all of us universally strongly agree that military subjugation to civilian control is absolutely necessary. That's a principle of American life that no one wants to see go away. But what's equally dangerous we don't talk about is the partisan co-opting of military force by any particular ideology or school of belief. What we've done, though, since the middle of the 1990s is send a clear signal to generals and admirals that if they disagree, even if they do it right, even if they don't do it out loud, even if they're just perceived to be disagreeing, even if they're respectful, they're still going to be fired. They're still going to be let go. I'll go back to Ron Fogelman, who quit a year early as the chief of staff of the Air Force. But the reason he quit is because he was being isolated. He was being ostracized in the administration for disagreeing with certain things. And the last thing he disagreed with was the scapegoating of a one-star general over the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia. And he chose not to support that decision and therefore to not resign, but retire instead. Starting with him, I can connect a whole bunch of dots that go through all different administrations on both sides of the political aisle that have continued to fire our senior leaders simply for showing us who they are. And the more we do that, the more they're going to hide who they are. And then the more they're going to start to say and make the noises that they need to make for a particular partisan ideology to give them a job or to not fire them. And that's where it gets dangerous, because then we can have one ideology come in and clean everybody out, and then the next one does the same thing in 4 years, and then 4 years later we do the same thing. All that instability, at the very least, makes us unready, but it could do much worse than that.
That's fascinating. I love it. It's a sycophantism that's permeating down the ranks, and that's what's driving a lot of this. It's brilliant insight, TC. Thanks.
Thanks for letting me elaborate on it. I don't know if it'll resonate with people, but I've got articles on 2 of the subjects we just talked about that'll come out soon, and if they spark conversations, I'll be happy about that. But I've been happy just to have the chance to share those thoughts with you two today.
No, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Tony.
Awesome.
I have a personal request for an article, which is, while these generals and admirals are going through their sycophantism, I think that's how you say it, in the military, and then 3 days after they retire, they end up on some major news network bashing all the things that they sent their Marines or soldiers or airmen in to die for. There's got to be some sort of psychology behind that, where they think that's okay.
Part 2 of this episode.
Part 2.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it is.
Revisionist history, GoFo revisionist history has become some of my most favorite reading as of late.
Yeah, it's
nicely played, cowards.
Yeah, I think one that comes to mind, I don't know, General McKenzie. I don't know. Anyways, all right. So Tony, it's been great. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Awesome.
And we very much look forward to seeing further articles from you. Everyone, please check out Tony's blog on Substack. It's titled The Radar. And if you really if you have a book at home and you write down words that you want to learn because you've never seen them before and you just think they're so stinking cool, kind of like in shitification, you got to read Tony's stuff. His vocabulary is amazing. It's absolutely fantastic. So thank you again,
Brilliant.
Tony. We really appreciate you.
It's all mine. And let me say before you stop recording, how much I value and appreciate what you do, what your foundation does. It is an honorable pursuit and something that not enough attention is given to. So the fact that you're doing it is noble, and I appreciate what you do, and I appreciate you having me on.
Thanks, TC.
All right.
Tony, bye.
See you both. Bye-bye.
Well, that's it for this week's topic. We really appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out our foundation website at walkthetalkfoundation.org.
And feel free to reach out and give us feedback. You can get a hold of us via Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our foundation's website. Details in the description section. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next episode.